This is Jeff Kupfer, and I want to welcome everybody to our ConservAmerica webinar today. Before I get to introducing our guests, I just want to tell you a little bit about our organization. The organization is nonprofit organization. We've been around for a few decades, but recently have made a renewed effort to drive policy debates towards more meaningful and impactful solutions. Towards that end, we're working on several fronts, including this webinar series intended to provide information on challenges and opportunities in the energy, environment, conservation space. We're also doing our webinars with our partners at EarthX as well. And we are developing and promoting market-oriented solutions to these challenges. And it's in that light that we're presenting today. We're really pleased to be joined by two guests today, Scott Segal and Lesley Clark. Scott is the co-chair of Bracewell's Policy Resolution Group, which is the government relations and strategic communications section at the firm. He has more than 2 decades of experience across a broad range of policy communication issues, particular experience dealing with energy and environmental natural resources. He's testified before Congress many times in other administrative agencies on these matters. Scott, as you all may know, also is recognized as a well-informed and well-versed spokesman on many of these issues and quoted quite regularly in national media, providing commentary. Lesley is at E&E News, where she covers these issues and writes very regularly and informs all of us about what's going on. She previously was a reporter with McClatchy, where she covered coal, Kentucky, and Senator Mitch McConnell. She also covered the White House for McClatchy, where she wrote a lot about clashes over taxes and spending, energy, climate change, also healthcare. She's reported from many different countries, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, Jordan, Russia, Mexico, Japan, and the list keeps going on and on. Lesley also worked at the Miami Herald, where she wrote a lot about offshore oil drilling and restoration of the Everglades. So we're certainly thrilled to be joined by them. We have a presentation that we're going to go through. Scott actually has prepared some slides, which we will use in a few minutes, but I also invite any of the attendees to send us some questions, and we'll do our best to try to get to any of them. Before we, and I'll just mention also, we have sort of 4 topics that we're going to try to run through today. Some may take a little bit longer than others, depending on the subject matter, but the first thing that we're going to do is talk about lame duck session of Congress, try to foreshadow what may happen there, and discuss issues that we'll see before the new Congress is sworn in January. We're also going to talk about something that's ongoing at the same time as the lame duck, which is the Biden transition. Talk a little bit about personnel, how we see that going, where it may go, things to look out for. We'll then turn to the Biden energy, environment, conservation agenda. Try to cover a lot of the different things that he discussed during the campaign and how that may have shifted post-election. And last thing is we'll try to take a look at the first 3-6 months of a Biden administration starting in 2021 and what we can expect moving forward. So with that all said, I will bring up the first topic, which is the lame duck. And let me turn it over to Lesley first to just kind of tell us what you're seeing in terms of your reporting. You spent a lot of time up on the Hill in the past and now, and sort of what can you give us an assessment of what issues we may see, whether anything may actually get done?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, whether anything may actually get done. There's a lot of talk today on getting a COVID package done. But I mean, it's so impossible every year. It happens every Christmas, especially if you're there on the 23rd day waiting for something to happen. So I am not going to hazard a guess as to whether anything will happen or not. It's just too difficult to tell. Other things we're kind of tracking in the lame duck. We saw today that the president obviously does not want to leave, and they've announced that they're going to open up oil drilling leases in Anwar. They have also created, he did back in October, a new class of personnel, Schedule F. And they've asked all the agencies to sort of put personnel into this class, and a lot of folks, especially within the agencies that employ a lot of scientists like EPA and Department of Energy, are very worried about this initiative. Even though it probably can't get completed by the time the administration leaves, they're afraid that it could sort of tie up the situation for an incoming Biden administration and make it a little bit tougher, perhaps, for him to hire back or to make sure that they can keep people that they want to keep, and conversely get rid of people that they don't want to get rid of. It could make it easier for political appointees to sort of burrow themselves into agencies. So I think there's sort of a lot happening, and time will tell on any of them.
Scott, you want to weigh in?
Sure, I'll add a little bit to it. Yeah, first of all, I'm so glad Lesley brought up Schedule F, because it's a very interesting issue. And for those who haven't been following it, it's an attempt to strip civil service protection away from sort of the guts of the agency's technical expertise. And that's a very serious issue if it were to occur. The first skirmish is going to be over the Office of Management and Budget, which is technically part of the Executive Office of the President. But imagine taking over a new administration where all the budget analysts who are not political appointees are gone. Now, the truth of the matter is that Joe Biden can reappoint them instantly if he chose to do, but it would be very disruptive, and people would lose clearances and all sorts of things. It would be a bad situation, but it might be just the kind of splashing of the water out of the bathtub that the president's famous for, that he might do on the way out. Just to turn to Congress for a second, a couple of different things, Jeff, popped to mind. Obviously, in the last couple of days, members of both the Democratic caucus in the House and the Republicans have chosen, in the case of the House, who their ranking members will be for the Republicans and who their awaiting final ratification by the Democratic caucus, which is going on as we speak. Who will be chairs and new appointments. Leadership on the Democratic side was essentially unopposed, as it was in the Senate, as was on the Republican side as well. For purposes, Jeff, of the folks that are interested in ConservAmerica's agenda, I would note that we have a new ranking member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Kathy McMorris Rogers, who, for those who've worked with her from Washington State, very talented person. Associated a lot with hydropower issues, associated with market mechanisms to address climate change, as opposed to command and control, but certainly not a climate denier by any stretch of the imagination. And we have a new ranking member of the House Natural Resources Committee too, and that's Bruce Westerman, who I'm sure many of your folks have worked with before. He's a forester. He's of the trillion trees, and of the legislation pertinent there too. So a fan of using natural offsets on the climate change side of things. So I think that's a good, and in each of in the case particularly of resources, he defeated a far more conservative opponent to get that nod. And that's probably a pretty good sign, actually, that resources will be an area where perhaps people can work together a little bit. We hope to see. And then in terms of the actual legislative agenda, just like Lesley says, it's hard to really predict what's going to go on. I tend to think, because as we sit here today, the president wants a COVID package, vice president or the president-elect wants a COVID package, and the leaders ostensibly of both chambers, both aisles, claim to want a COVID package. Who am I to say that they can't get their act together to get at least a sub-trillion-dollar COVID package ready to roll? Obviously, all eyes are cast on what's going to happen in the omnibus or cromnibus, as it's sometimes called. The distinction being, you pass a bunch of the appropriations bills, and what you can't get done, you put in a continuing resolution and let it go. I'm getting a lot of calls in the last 24 hours, people asking me, do you think the government will shut down? I really don't. But predicting what Donald Trump would do in the last month of his term is well, it's a fool's errand, frankly, to try and predict that. So he could do it for show. He could do it because he's mad about the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, not including his sort of warfare on social media. I mean, he could. There's a lot of reasons why he could do it. We assume, though, that as a rational actor, he does not. It would not help, for example, in that Senate race on January 5th, the runoff election in Georgia, to have the government shut down because the president vetoed the continuing resolution. Right. So anyway, that's kind of how I see it.
Scott, I do want to circle back a little bit on the personnel in a second, but just in terms of legislation that may come, whether it's a continuing resolution, different people have talked about whether there's actually a chance for some energy-related legislation or environmental legislation. I think even Senator Manchin mentioned that at one point in the last week or two that he thought that maybe there was a chance of something, because there are some fairly consensus bills that are out there. I mean, do either one of you see any chance that anything other than just sort of basic COVID or continuing resolution can actually get through in the next month and a half?
I don't.
Let me. I agree with you, Lesley, but there is a chance, and hope springs eternal on this. And when I went to bed last night, one of the key staffers on one of the committees of substantive jurisdiction, I don't want to give away who it was, but said to me, I think the chances are 60-40 that we do get something on the energy bill. Then this morning on the way in, I am at my office, very rare appearance here. On the way in this morning, I talked to another staffer on the Energy and Commerce Committee who said, I don't think it's going to happen. So here's the deal. We've talked about energy efficiency legislation and research in the context of the so-called Shaheen-Portman legislation for a long time. That became the base of what Senator Murkowski has been advancing. Senator Murkowski called Chairman Pallone of the Energy and Commerce Committee and said, look, I really want to get this done. It's a legacy issue. My last hurrah as chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And Pallone was not unmoved by that, and they have tried to come together. They put an awful lot of staff time into this. In the last week, a lot of all-nighters being pulled by staffers to get it done. But before anybody gets too excited, Jeff, no tax extenders, none of that, none of the green tax incentives that people are all looking at. That's not there. No authorization of any kind of regulatory authority, no building codes, not even all of Portman Shaheen. No, a probable stripping of the environmental justice provisions that Eddie Bernice Johnson, the chair of the Science Committee, has been so strong in having in that bill. Pipeline safety is not part of it, but it runs side saddle with it. And on the pipeline safety side of things, there's still a lot of negotiation going on. It could go, but I think its chances are actually slightly less, for the very reason that I think particularly Peter DeFazio thinks he can get a better deal next year. So that's kind of what's going on. I can't deny the 60-40, but I just don't. I have no on the ground data that tells me that we're going to get it. But it's not. It's certainly in play.
Okay. Let me just on the personnel, just because I think some of our listeners may be interested. And you talked about on the Republican side the two new ranking members, Westerman and McMorris Rodgers. I guess question first part was that a surprise to either one of you that they ended up in those roles, and does that say anything about the Republican Party beginning to maybe change sort of the view, or at least the perception of the party in terms of dealing with some of these issues moving forward?
Yeah, I don't know how much it says on actual action, but I do think it definitely shows an attention to perception and a willingness to sort of put people forward who are more, moderate on the views and could be at least a little bit more open to perhaps some deal making with Democrats and sort of looking ahead. And like Scott said, they Bruce Westerman beat back a conservative opponent on this. So that certainly says something. He also beat back the geographical concerns that some people had, that it's generally somebody from a Western state and he's from a Southern state. So I definitely, this was I don't know, a surprise move, but definitely an unusual move, and one that I think there's a lot of you can take look at it a lot of different ways on both of those people.
Yeah, and I would just add on, I totally agree with what Lesley said, and I would also add with respect to Kathy McMorris Rodgers, as a former member of leadership and someone popular in the caucus, I wasn't necessarily surprised by the outcome, but I will say that the person with seniority on the committee would have been Dr. Burgess from Texas, and he did contest the seat vigorously. And I'm from, Jeff, as you know, I'm from Texas, and I heard, thunder from down in Texas of people being called and asked to talk on his behalf and to really advance the cause. So I think that's I think that's a good win for her, for Kathy McMorris Rodgers, and I think that was not necessarily a foregone conclusion, but she was definitely in the pole position, we'll just say, when the steering committee met.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on from lame duck and begin to discuss transition. And speaking of transition, I think Scott's actually going to try to share his screen. We'll see if that works for all of us.
All right. Let's give it a whirl here.
There are a number of slides that we'll try to walk through, and the first slide.
What are you seeing? What are you seeing now?
Brilliant.
The outline slide.
Did we do it?
Yeah, we can move.
Okay.
Nice
we're
job.
advancing.
We'll move to the next one.
Right.
All right. Excellent. So what we'll do to try to keep this conversational is Scott's going to walk through some of his slides. I will likely break in here and there and ask some questions, and Lesley will do the same. But at least for now, Scott, let's go over to you, and why don't you at least give us a sense of some of the key people in the transition, the ones that have been appointed thus far, and kind of what that says about his overall approach. And then we can also talk about some of the ones that haven't been picked yet.
Okay. Very good. So we're not married to everything on these slides, so I'm gonna cook a little bit with oil here, Jeff, and
right.
move out smartly, as they say. So obviously, the transition process is different than who will actually get the appointments at a cabinet or sub-cabinet level, and oftentimes there's a high wall of separation between who wins in transition and or who leads in transition, who gets ultimate posts. It surprises no one that Ted Kaufman was headed up transition. It was a longtime chief of staff to then Senator Biden, and it was actually the acting senator from Delaware when Biden took the vice presidency the first time around, and is a very calm institutionalist, I would say, and is running a very calm transition process that is handing out appointments or making known appointments in a piecemeal fashion, but in a very orderly fashion. A great set of co-chairs reflecting both governmental and economic experience, House and Senate governor seats, and past experience in the Obama administration. This time around, we used to call them landing teams back in the olden days, but they are called agency review teams in this transition process, or ARTs. And the ones that are of most concern probably to folks here, Patrice Sims, he was a person who was in the Office of General Counsel at EPA. He also was an advisor to the Environmental Appeals Board and is now at Earth Justice, the old Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. He serves a point that I want to make sure everybody is fully understanding of, which is that, look, you're going to look at these review teams and look at these individuals and maybe look at just the last part of their resume and say, oh, well, these are an activist, et cetera. But most of the people on the ARTs have practical experience in the agencies in which they are being assigned, and Sims is one of those. Arun Majumdar is somebody who we'll talk about a little bit more later, because he is also someone who is a lead candidate to be the Secretary of Energy, but he's also leading the agency review team. He's a professor at Berkeley. He's a material scientist by training, and was worked at one of the national labs, Lawrence Berkeley. But the most important part of his background is he stood up in the Obama administration the ARPA-E program. And as you know, a major part of the Biden climate package is setting up an ARPA-C, a climate change related Advanced Research Projects Administration that will be emphasizing scalability and commercialization of technology. And Majumdar is a good person to do that. Kevin Washburns at the University of Iowa heads up the Interior Transition Team. Now, just to talk about people who've already been announced in terms of appointments, everyone I'm sure knows that Ron Klain, a long-time hand in Washington, someone who was chief of staff both to then Vice President Biden, and to then Vice President Al Gore. So somebody who's really seen things go around. Someone who was the Ebola czar when that was a threat, so understands a sort of a pandemic and disease, the structure of those issues, and just knows a lot of people in this city. The economic team is already out. They had their first press conference on December 1st. That's Janet Yellen as the Treasury Secretary. Brian Deese, somewhat controversial out of BlackRock, but previously out of both the OMB and the National Economic Council in the Obama administration. Still, I remember dealing with Brian back then and thinking, gosh, he's a young fella. He's still a young fella, but he's definitely a smart fella.
Hey, Scott,
yeah,
let me just pause you for 1 second, because I know that Lesley's written a little bit about the economic team and some of the views that they have and some other things. So Lesley, let me just pause there, and if you can give us your take on how the economic team may fit into kind of the overall
Sure.
Picture, and what it says about the people that have been appointed.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say that I think a number of the people, the economic team, him rolling it out quickly, it sort of gives us a good insight in how Biden is going to want to use like sort of an all of government approach when he looks at climate change. He didn't just choose people who are, economists and numbers people, but people who have had significant background in dealing with energy issues. That begins with Yellen, who has, been very much out front about using the economic costs of climate change in financing. Brian Deese worked for Obama. He was very involved in the auto bailout and was very helpful in getting mileage standards involved in the bailout. He's also been involved with some of the monuments that Obama set out to enlarge monuments. Deese was involved in that. So I think it sends a sort of a message to folks that Biden wants people to know that his administration will be looking at climate, not just in the EPA and in Interior and the Department of Energy, but overall in every federal agency.
Okay, great. And then Scott, let me just direct you to maybe cover somebody else who's actually been appointed rather than some of the conjecture, and which we can come back to in a second. But the president-elect has appointed John Kerry to be his international envoy, and there's still discussions about a counterpart in the White House and how they're going to structure it a little bit. What does the Kerry appointment say to you in terms of focus? Once again, was that a surprise to anybody? Does it tell us anything that we didn't already suspect in terms of the Biden agenda going into the election?
Well, personally, I was not surprised by the appointment of John Kerry to a position of some authority in the climate area. And I think he's probably uniquely suited to be a climate envoy, which is visualized as an internationally focused position. Of course, his skill set, being a former Secretary of State and a former very active senator in this area, speaks volumes about the degree of political capital that I think Biden wants to place on an early promise, which is getting back into the Paris Accord and probably on a renegotiated national commitment under Paris. And I think Kerry will play a very vital role as far as that's concerned. The interesting question for me is, what does that mean for the domestic climate person also at the White House? So for example, there'd been a lot of discussion about from New York State, Ali Zaidi taking that position, but you have a question of equal dignities there. A former U.S. Senator, Secretary of State. Does that mean we're going to see an elevation in the domestic policy, climate policy role? That's a good question. There are a lot of governors that could fill that role, a lot of former cabinet officials that could fill that role. And so that's really what we have to see. The one thing I'll say about everything on this list, unlike the economic team where Biden arguably moved out smartly, these key climate positions and these other positions are probably about 10 days away. And I know that doesn't sound like a long period of time, but in comparison to how quickly the other nominations came out, and one of the reasons is that on the economic team, it's a tug of war between what you can get past the Congress and what would fulfill the economic recovery desires that the president-elect has. For these positions, interior, energy, domestic policy on climate change, DOE. Here we have a three-way tug of war, if you can imagine such a thing, because progressives have a very definite position that is to the left, I believe, of where the Biden folks would like to be. Then you have the heart and soul of the Biden team itself, and then you have who can pass confirmation on the Senate side, should the Senate remain in Republican hands. So it's a much more interesting dynamic, and that's why it's been delayed a little bit, frankly, in comparison to other cabinet positions.
Leslie, you have anything you want to add on that, either on maybe the White House structure, since I know you covered it? Does it matter if there's a National Climate Council for actually getting stuff done, or as long as you have the right people there, things will happen? And anything you want to add in terms of, a tug of war?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with what Scott was saying. There's a tug of war being done, as it is in every administration, between what you want to do, what it will be possible with Congress, and what your left flank or your right flank, whoever is loudest at the time, wants to get. So I think they're sort of dealing with that. And I think they also know, I think it will make it easier once they've decided on what exactly is the National Climate Council. Is it based at the White House? Is it, sub-cabinet level? Where is it? Who is it? Who chairs that? Is it a big, is it Jay Inslee, or is it a big name like that? And that makes it a little bit easier to get people. Like at Department of Energy, you want somebody who knows details, because a lot of what they're going to be able to do in terms of climate change, I mean, we'll talk later about that, about legislation, but a lot of what they'll be doing is like the regulations, the executive orders, the little stuff, and you want detail-oriented folks with experience in those positions.
Okay, great. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, I can round out this slide, I think, in fairly quickly. Obviously, there's still an open question about the EPA administrator. A lot of discussion about the current chair of the California Air Resources Board, Mary Nichols, who on several other occasions has also been considered to be a nominee for the EPA and has not gotten that post. She has announced her retirement from CARB effective at the end of this year, and would very much, out of her own mouth, very much would like to have the EPA position. There is a movement, I think, in the Senate at this point of folks who look back about the 56 times that she's sued the federal government over the last 4 years about regulatory reforms or initiatives or rollbacks, depending on your point of view. The position she's taken vis-a-vis the internal combustion engine, and I go on and on. That could give her some challenges. Heather Toney, a former mayor, a former Region 4 administrator, and now sort of a grassroots activist, might also face some confirmation issues, which has raised the profile of somebody that, Jeff, you probably know well, Colin O'Mara, who's the president and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, but was the head of the agency, the environmental agency in the state of Delaware, so is well known to Biden world. There's a very interesting tug of war going on here, and I'm not in a position to make a prediction, but I do see how forces are moving, at least to consider it.
Yeah, I would just say we've worked closely with Colin and NWF over the years, and he would be a great selection from our standpoint, but we'll see, just because he knows the issues and
right.
Understands the process. Let me just ask you one thing, Scott, because just want to make sure that we keep moving along through everything. Do you see any room for a Republican I guess in the cabinet generally, I mean, they've talked about that, but in any of these areas, is there any chance that, that there'll be a reach across the aisle for these types of issues?
Here's my view, and this is just totally what my gut tells me. In these particular, in the energy and environmental space, I think there's enough of this three-way, this triangular discussion that it would be difficult to have a Republican be in a position like that. I do think there might be other parts of the other parts of the executive branch that might feature Republicans. I mean, one could imagine a United States Trade Representative, for example, or somebody like that. You know, people often point to the Commerce Department, although our old buddy Tom Steyer is very interested in that position, and he did a very nice job in assisting Democratic candidates in the last election. So I don't know what to think about the Commerce Department right now, but I think there would be a lot of pushback from the left of the party if you know, we hear names, of course, like John Kasich and people like that, but it's hard to tell.
Right. Okay. All right. Why don't we move on to the next sort of set of issues, which is kind of the general Biden E&E agenda, shall we say, environment and energy agenda, and some of their key positions. So Scott, once again, we'll go to you, and I know you have a lot on these slides, and we may not
Right.
sort of cover all of them, but we'll pick a few things out that you want to address, and Lesley as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the bullets are self-explanatory, so it won't go bullet by bullet. But if I drew a big circle, red circle around this, I want to make 2 points. The first is that the sort of lead initiative, the takeaway line about Biden on climate, has been these interlocking promises about reduction of CO2 out of the economy. So a net zero emission approach to carbon by 2050 for the entire economy, decarbonization specifically of the power sector by 2035. I think at best you would say the 2035 goal for the power sector is a stretch goal. In other words, it's good to have goals to incentivize investment, but you know, most folks in the power sector have centered on 2050 as their power sector goal. And as I heard one CEO tell me, in fact, I've heard more than one CEO say this, we chose 2050 for a reason, because that's what flanges up with our what we think about the robustness of technological innovation and availability of money and integrated resource planning and the like. We've talked about Paris on day one, but the other thing I wanted to point out is if I parboil down the energy plans that Biden has released and look at the gross number of words that are uttered, he said a lot about energy and environment. Maybe not in the specificity that some would like, but he said a lot. B, a lot of it is framed around the use of legislative tools like a clean energy standard that he'd have to work with the Congress in. And you know, he may be more uniquely positioned to do that than many. And C, he has really stressed what I would call a technologically optimistic innovation agenda. So for every 2 words on a mandate, he's had 5 words on innovation and an innovation agenda. So standing up ARPA-C, you'll see it in his materials, doubling down on this technology, battery storage, hydrogen, you name it, advanced motor fuels, as well as electric vehicles. So, you know, there's just a lot of stuff he's been talking about that would require the kind of valley of death sort of inquiry that the federal government and its lab system is situated to do.
Okay. Lesley, anything you want to add in sort of big picture in terms of any of these policy items?
No, I think Scott brought it up a lot. He mentions, I was going to mention unions, which he has in the slide, that's been a big focus for Biden as well. I mean, when he usually talks about energy, it's the second or third word will be jobs. He's looked at it as a way to sort of marry the COVID economic collapse and climate change by suggesting that, you know, by spending money and by investing in green energy, you'll be able to create jobs. And so he's pulled the union in pretty close on that.
So let me ask, one of the issues you've identified or bullets here is ending the regulatory rollbacks. And so do you envision basically going back to where the Obama administration was? Because as we know, the Obama Clean Power Plan, for instance, was under was on hold pending court decisions. We arguably have, not arguably, we have a more conservative judiciary now than there was, 4 years ago. And so as we think about regulation, should we think about it as, okay, let's just rewind the clock 4 years, or some sort of different type of regulation?
I think you.
Go on. No, Leslie, you go.
No, I was going to say, I think you could probably look at both. I mean, in some ways, they're going to be looking to reversals. That the Trump administration has reversed Obama, and they'll be looking to reverse Trump, reversing those. I think there's also going to be new regulations and rules that they'll be looking at, because things have changed so much since the Obama administration was in office.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, with respect to the Clean Power Plan, it's a little bit overtaken by events, in the sense that the power sector has had great strides in emissions reductions now, and it's not just because we've had a pandemic which has suppressed demand for energy, but it's far more than that. It's that there's been hundreds of billions of dollars of investments made in new generations of generation technology, and the target that the CPP was aiming for has somewhat been reached. Plus, it is a bit of an overinterpretation of what was available under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. As you pointed out, Jeff, in all my time working in Washington, I've never seen the Supreme Court stay a rule of general applicability. And they did in the case of the Clean Power Plan, and if anything, the court's gotten more conservative. So I don't think that that's the direction. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of things that could be done to address climate change issues. For example, methane rules, both on public lands and private lands, and we'll talk about that later, I suppose, but those are things that could be done. They have been subject to litigation already, so the contours of that issue are known. And they could do things in the power sector too, regarding efficiency, regarding carbon capture and sequestration, for example. So there's room to maneuver. I would raise one little flag though. It's not as easy as it used to be to just reverse executive orders, and you can thank Donald Trump for that, because when he tried to reverse the Dreamers treatment, you may recall that last summer, or this summer, I should say, a case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can't just turn around a use of enforcement discretion or an executive order that the regulated community has come to rely upon without a sufficient administrative record, an explanation of why. That is a warning sign probably to the incoming Biden administration that when it is dismantling some of the more egregious administrative actions in its view, that it needs to be careful to do it the right way, and to take a blunderbuss approach might run afoul, ironically, of a legal patina which has grown up around Trump's desire to do the same thing to Obama proposals. So right. It's something to look out for.
Interesting. And we have a question that came in regarding electric vehicles, and I just might as well ask it now, which is that Biden has been proposing to have 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations across the country by 2030. How likely do you think it is that can be accomplished? And should the traditional fuel transportation industry, should they be very concerned about where things are going right now?
Well, I'll get us started on this. The 500,000 new charging stations is another one of these stretch goals, and it's meant to encourage folks to make investments. Now, that said, if I were if I were a producer of liquid motor fuels, which could be a petroleum refiner, could be a biofuel manufacturer, or something like it, I don't believe the internal combustion engine is going to leave us anytime soon. I think the market for automobiles kind of segments in a lot of different ways, and there are some things that are uniquely suited for internal combustion engines. And so what I think a Biden administration might do is try and encourage a build out of infrastructure for electric vehicles, but not go the way necessarily of California and what Governor Newsom did, and actually sort of mandate the phase out of internal combustion engines. I think that could create some consumer backlash issues. So I think probably what we're looking at is build out of infrastructure, maybe tax credits, changing the way taxes are evaluated and applied. But I don't know that we're looking at mandates per se, because that can be sort of dangerous. Now, if I made liquid motor fuels, I might say that Biden might also consider an improvement in automobile efficiency, particularly deeper penetration of what are called high compression engines, because that's the way you get to the next level of energy efficiency. And to do that, that means higher octane fuels, which is probably good news for refiners and for biofuel manufacturers. So as these policies proceed, there could be a pony in it on both sides of the liquid motor fuel, electric vehicle, and hydrogen vehicle in this day and age side effects. So,
Lesley, how do you assess that? And to the extent that some of your Hill contacts or whatever, how do you think the Hill in general is looking at electric vehicles, and is it split along party lines per se, or some other way?
Yeah, I don't know that it is. I mean, it is definitely split along party lines, but also you definitely have Republicans who are interested in. Is it Tom Massey who has his house, I think, runs on a Tesla battery or a couple of old Tesla batteries. So you definitely have fans out there. I don't know that he drives. Maybe he does drive an electric car. But I would totally agree with Scott that it is more of an incentive, more of a way to push and encourage and prod the industry into new technology rather than any sort of mandate that he's going to be able to do. Republicans are definitely not interested, a lot of Democrats are not interested in any sort of mandating people into what they can drive.
Okay, great. All right, Scott, let's keep going to some of your other slides, and we'll try to keep moving along. Thanks.
So we've already talked about this, luckily, Jeff. We've talked about money for R&D. We've talked about, I'll add to that, the use of federal procurement as a way to increase the purchase of clean energy. Here I'm talking about renewable power. We've talked about the use of a clean energy standard as a mechanism to advance it. And we've talked about the shortfalls potentially of restoring or expanding the Clean Power Plan. Legal constructs are interesting. There's been a lot of discussion of environmental justice. It goes in two directions. One is making sure that new renewables investments occur in places that confer benefit, and I mean economic benefit, on frontline communities. The other, of course, is in looking at permits for things like pipelines or transmission lines, is making sure that EJ considerations are taken into account there. And maybe even support for plaintiffs' climate change suits. That's what the CC is, climate change lawsuits. They have not been successful, the climate change lawsuits, but could they be if a Biden Justice Department were to intervene in those cases and try and advance the ball? That's an unknown, I think, at this point. And lots of discussion of tax credits, battery storage, carbon capture and sequestration, renewables, current like wind and solar, renewables on the horizon, literally, like offshore wind. All of those are under consideration for a green tax credit package. And there is an area where I think you can have a lot of bipartisan compromise on the tax credit issues.
Okay, great. All right, let's move to public lands then.
Public lands, right? Public lands. Well, during the course of the campaign, the Biden campaign did not speak a lot to public lands issues, and I think there are political reasons for that, about their how viable they wanted to be out west. But if you do sift through it all, you come up with a few nuggets. One of them is renewables, a explicit promise to try and develop renewables on federal lands and waters, and herein that doubling of offshore wind by 2030. And then there's the whole question of oil and gas on public lands. And people, I think, can remember back to the second presidential debate when there was a bit of a set-to about whether Biden was going to ban fracking or not. And he clarified the view, as he had on other previous occasions, and said he was calling for a prohibition of new oil and gas projects on public lands. But if you unpack that, and I know many of your members, Jeff, are interested in this, there's a question. Does that mean no new leasing or no new permitting? if you already own the lease, already had the lease. And I will tell you as a lawyer now, it is very difficult to restrict permitting once somebody has a property interest in a lease. That's difficult. As far as having no new leasing, you know, the Obama administration on 2 separate occasions, post-Macondo, the Deepwater Horizon on the offshore and with respect to coal, attempted to do moratoria on leasing and were turned back by the courts. And one of the reasons is the Mineral Leasing Act says, and the Offshore Act for offshore resources says, that you have to hold these quarterly lease auctions, unless, but on, quote, available land. So the issue would be, can Biden declare that land is unavailable and therefore there's no need for additional leasing? That is on very, I'm not playing off Lesley Clark's news about Anwar. I'll just say that's on very thin ice to make that argument. And I think that would be much contested in court. And the reason I have New Mexico on here is just to say, it's just interesting to me that the 3 leading candidates to be the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, and both New Mexico senators are indeed from New Mexico. And New Mexico is a state that literally gets $1 billion a year in royalty revenue off of oil and gas production on public lands, and 37% of the state is public lands, or is federal land. So it's hard for me to believe that at least Governor Lujan Grisham wants to see a total ban on oil and gas production on federal lands when that kind of numbers are at stake. Now, in fact, she said to the vice president-elect that she hoped New Mexico would be exempt from that. And I'm not sure how you would do that, but it's a very interesting dynamic given who may be headed over to Interior.
Right, and we actually got a question about that from one of the viewers asking about the fact that the Interior candidates are from New Mexico, and then you have this issue. So do you think that cuts towards maybe not selecting one of them as the secretary because these are such important issues, or does it cut towards, well, they may get selected and then it'll influence the policy?
Well, it somewhat depends on which New Mexican is advanced, because the senators are already on record trying to come up with, let me just give you an example of a middle point solution. I wouldn't attribute this to either senator, but there are middle point solutions. For example, if you had a very strong BLM rule on methane emissions from gas production on public lands, you might say, look, what we've done is we've made gas production on public lands more climate sensitive. And so that's as far as we can go given the balance of equities here. Now, the one person who's been a little bit more on point on this has been Deb Haaland, who who's a member of the House of Representatives, and she has said that she thinks maybe there's too much production. I don't want to put words in her mouth because she's certainly never said that she would ban it or anything like that. But she seems to be a little bit more willing to take to be aggressive in that area, perhaps, than the senators have been. Although, I'm sure they would be quite supportive of tough environmental controls on production on federal lands.
Okay. Well, while we're talking about natural gas production, why don't we move to the next slide? I know we want to talk about that. And Lesley, you should also feel free to weigh in on any of this as we go forward.
Yeah. Look, as it said on a slide a little bit ago, natural gas, it's complicated. It's complicated because you saw the complication that that Biden faced in the debates over fracking, et cetera, and statements he made to the Building Trades Council in Pittsburgh. It's just tough. I'm not going to go through all of these things because we've talked about it, a lot of them before, but I want to make one big point. Joe Biden describes his bona fides on the climate side in terms of his participation, for example, in helping President Obama reach a good conclusion in Paris. When Obama was signing the preliminary paperwork in Paris, Biden too had a European trip, but he was in Eastern Europe encouraging folks to either investigate hydraulic fracturing on their own reserves and or to buy U.S. LNG because he felt there was a strong foreign policy case. And remember, Biden is a big fan of a robust foreign policy. He thought there was a foreign policy case to rely more on natural gas to reduce the leverage of Vladimir Putin. Now, obviously, we don't live in the same world that we lived in then, and climate change, I think, has moved up a tick or two in terms of the significance as a policy objective. But I do not believe that the president-elect has a thoroughgoing enmity for natural gas. I believe he sees that there's a need to control its environmental consequences, but I believe he also sees that it plays important economic and foreign policy advantages and trade deficits. So he's, I think, a little bit more canny than what you might have read, on left-wing or right-wing blogs on this subject matter.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on the LNG exports. He was pretty quiet about LNG exports during the entire campaign. And we actually did a story looking at, is he going to be the worst thing for oil ever? And, a lot of people, like in the LNG, people were like, I don't think so. Watch this space. We've been very encouraged, like Scott mentioned, that where he was during Obama signing the Paris Accord. So I think that the LNG export people are looking at it pretty seriously, and they have an argument to make where, especially in Europe, different countries buying American LNG as opposed to burning coal could be a good thing. So I think that's definitely a space we're going to be paying a lot of attention to.
And in any event, it'll be more about public lands, as we discussed, and less about private lands, because they're really, states maintain primacy from a regulatory perspective on private land.
Right.
And if you look at the Marcellus Shale, for example, that's not federal land at all. That's all private. Mm-hmm. So, and that's arguably the most productive element.
Okay, great. All right, we're down to our last few minutes here, so we're not going to have time to kind of cover everything or even part of everything. But since let's talk about what may happen at the beginning of a Biden term in terms of looking at administrative actions, and then if we have a little bit of time, we can talk about legislative. Sure. And just let me frame it with one question as we think about administrative actions, and it sort of goes back to the regulatory piece. There's been discussion in the past about maybe there's a trade to be had at some point between sort of of not doing as much through a regulatory system and doing a little bit more through maybe a carbon pricing scheme or something else. Is there a trade there between people who really want to push the regulatory envelope? And I'd be interested in just sort of addressing that kind of big picture, and then maybe we can, if we have a little bit of time, we can cover some of the specifics.
So this list, I never mean to go through it item by item, but This is your 3x5 index card of things that could happen in the first 6 months. And there are probably more, and some of these things are probably too bold. On the broader question of carbon pricing, well, first of all, if you want, most carbon pricing regimes are going to take legislation, of course. And now there's a boutique interest about could FERC use its cover one eye and use its existing authority over reasonable and just rates and create a de facto carbon tax. Don't bet your farm on that. That winds up in court until the cows come home, and that's not a methane reference. I would say the problem with carbon taxes is that the far left is of the judgment that they're not prescriptive enough because they don't mandate an outcome. And the far right doesn't like the word taxes, even though they would be more efficient and less prescriptive than command and control regulation. So it's kind of in a no man's land. That said, smart people, and there are lots of them, do like carbon pricing regimes. And one of them is Janet Yellen, who has been fairly vocal on this subject recently. And I might add that, a cap and trade program of the sort that John Kerry and Joe Lieberman advanced, it is in a sense a carbon pricing regime too. So market-related mechanisms like that have a proud history, even among Democratic politicos and experts. Here's your best chance to get a carbon pricing regime. If the Democrats do take back the Senate, but it's 50 freaking 50. with Kamala Harris as VP breaking ties, it'll be very hard to pass a carbon pricing mechanism through regular order, but it will open up the possibility of using the sort of arcane budget reconciliation process. And since a carbon tax raises revenue, it would be legal as an aspect of budget reconciliation. So a 50-50 tie in the Senate, I think, raises the prospect of a carbon tax in a revenue-hungry next Congress.
Okay, well, let me, just because we're about to wrap up, so let me just ask that sort of general question rather than getting to specific legislative outcomes that could happen. But we won't know control of the Senate until the beginning of January. And so as both of you look at that going forward, how big a deal is it? I mean, you just made the point about the reconciliation vehicle, Scott, but you still have Joe Manchin, who would have to be convinced, and some other Democrats. So how big a deal is it in terms of actually enacting legislation, whether it's 50-50 with the VP breaking the tie, or whether it's a Republican with a Senate with a slim majority? Lesley, why don't we?
Oh, I think it's enormous. I mean, it would be huge for the Democrats if they're able to get just to the, a teeny, even equality in the Senate would be enormous for them for getting stuff through, like Scott said, because there's so many sort of like budgetary tricks and all kinds of, running the calendar, owning the calendar is a good thing. I mean, anything that they could do to get to 50 would be hugely important for them. Like you said, you've got Joe Manchin on the, and that you have a wide variety of Democrats. So.
Okay.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is controlling the calendar, yes, and also remember all the leadership of the committees also changes.
Right.
But for that one vote, Jeff, you've got Tom Carper's the head of EPW and not Shelley Moore Capito, and that's the Committee of Substantive Jurisdiction, and he has a different agenda, and he's very close to the White House. So that alone would be a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been a great hour. Let me and we won't know about the Senate, obviously, but maybe it'll be a good opportunity to have you both back on, and we can discuss what may happen once that's determined. And so, Scott and Lesley, we really appreciate it. I don't know if either one of you has any sort of wrap-up comment or two that you want to make, and we'll finish up. Lesley, Scott?
No, it's just thanks for having me. I hope we were interesting and answered all the questions. I'd love to come back and send me questions. If you have any hints or anybody you're hearing on the Biden transition, please let me know.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to put in a plug for if anybody has any good tidbits that they want to send Lesley's way, you should feel free to do so.
Yeah, any news tips, I welcome them. Thank you.
Okay. Scott,
Well,
thanks again.
And now I'm thinking back on my presentation, and I'm hoping it did not constitute news tips. But no,
right.
Thanks, Jeff. I really want to give a shout out to your organization too, which I think plays a really important role in an area which can be so polarizing. So it's good to have more centrist organizations on energy, environment, and natural resource issues.
Okay, well, we appreciate that. These are important issues, and we hope that more and more people will get engaged on it, on them all. So we thank everybody for listening, and thanks to Scott and Lesley for participating, and stay tuned for our next webinar coming up. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.